We're all set for tomorrow.
What about this
No, sorry, 9 to 2. Sorry, the whole event is 9 to 2, but the public portion is 9 to 2. We're going to end it. That's actually the when we're done, are we okay to just step aside with Aaron? Great call. Yeah. In the shadows.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Molly Reynolds. I'm a senior fellow in governance studies here at Brookings, and along with David Wessel, my colleague in economic studies and the director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy, I want to welcome you to today's event. Next month, the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act will celebrate its 50th birthday. We don't have cake today, but we do want to take this opportunity to take stock of some of the biggest consequences of the law that set out much of our contemporary fiscal policymaking process, and equally as importantly, to look ahead to the next 50 years. It's common, to the point of cliche, to hear that the process is broken, but our goal for today is to think about what the challenges it or any other process we might come up with needs to be equipped to address are, and what the political obstacles or perhaps opportunities are for getting there. Our agenda is as follows. First, we'll hear from Phil Joyce of the University of Maryland, who's going to summarize for us a paper that he's written for the occasion, assessing the degree to which the Budget Act has fulfilled its drafters' goals and outlining what its biggest consequences have been. From there, we'll hear from two panels. The first, moderated by David, and featuring Doug Elmendorf of the Harvard Kennedy School, Anna Aizer of Brown, and Sanjay Patnaik of Brookings, will address budgeting challenges in a few key policy areas. And the second, moderated by Lisa Desjardins of PBS, and featuring me, my Brookings colleague Sarah Binder, and John Sides of Vanderbilt, will address the political dynamics of meeting those challenges. So thank you for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Phil.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to the Hutchins Center and to Brookings for holding this event and for giving me the opportunity to think and write about the impacts of the 1974 Budget Act, however depressing that process was. My intent in the time I have available is to briefly review the purposes and the results of the 1974 Budget Act, focusing most of my attention on what I believe to be the two main impacts of the Act. That is the creation of CBO and the increasing role of budget reconciliation in the federal policymaking process. As Molly said, there's a paper, so for those of you who are gluttons for punishment, I go into way more detail in the paper than I will in my 10 minutes here, but I hope to sort of hit the high points at least. I think it's important, as is often the case, to start at the beginning. And so I want to steal from Bill Douster's biblically inspired historical description of the Senate to say that prior to 1974, the congressional budget process, quote, was a shapeless, chaotic mass. And as nature abhors a vacuum, this meant that after 1921, the budget process, at least in a macro sense, focused on the president and the president's budget. The Congress had no capacity to budget, to borrow from Alan Schick, in the sense that the Congress never focused on the whole, only the disconnected parts. Moreover, presidents took advantage of this by trying to exercise as much control over the budget as they could. The Budget Act of 1974 tried to correct this imbalance between the branches by doing three things. First, by controlling impoundments, or presidents refusing to spend money that had been appropriated by Congress. Second, by attempting to correct the failure to look at overall fiscal policy by creating the budget committees and the budget resolution. And third, by addressing the dependence of the Congress on the executive for information by creating CBO. And I would say two of these three goals have been achieved. Presidential impoundments have been effectively curbed, and CBO has armed the Congress with economic and budgetary information to a greater extent than I think the founders of CBO and the Congress at the time could have imagined. But the third, permitting the Congress to exercise control over aggregate fiscal policy, has been, to be generous, a hit-and-miss proposition. There have been times when the budget process has fostered important policy changes, particularly in the 1990s, when various deficit reduction agreements moved the budget from deficit to surplus. But particularly over the last 25 years, the budget resolution process has tended to increase federal debt or has been used purely to provide partisan ammunition to one party or another. At the same time, the budget process, which already had been criticized for a lack of timeliness even before 1974, has gotten even less timely with later appropriations and more and longer government shutdowns. As I already mentioned, the two most significant changes that have resulted from the Budget Act have been the ascendancy of the reconciliation process and the influence of CBO. The first of these was totally unexpected, as reconciliation was a relatively minor part of the process initially. It was discovered by the Reagan administration as a way to make major changes without having to overcome a Senate filibuster, and it has now become the main way for congressional majorities to get big things done without needing to appeal to the minority party. Hence the use of reconciliation for the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, for the portions of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, for the Trump tax cuts in 2017, and for the Inflation Reduction Act, among others. And because of the Byrd rule, reconciliation has also tended at times to preference Senate actions over House ones. CBO's influence, on the other hand, was anticipated, but not to the extent that it has developed. There are several factors that have contributed to CBO's rising influence. First and foremost, decisions made by its first director, the great Alice Rivlin, assisted initially by her assistant, Bob Reischauer, who became its third director, committed the agency to making hiring decisions and developing policies that emphasize strong analytical independence and neutralities. Subsequent directors, and I look at Doug Elmendorf when I say this, have sustained that ethic and have been strongly supported by the budget committees. The budget committees have actually been very responsible in their selection of CBO directors and have protected the agency in general from political influence. Second, the Congress and then the press discovered CBO. And why did they discover CBO? They discovered CBO because CBO began to cast a skeptical eye on claims by various presidents, primarily in the early stages, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And in addition, CBO's influence has tended to rise during times when more attention is paid to deficits. But even when the Congress isn't paying attention to deficits, I think there is a general consensus that the influence of CBO scoring, that is, its cost estimates of individual pieces of legislation, is undeniable. Overall, CBO has empowered the Congress to challenge claims by presidents in a way that was certainly underestimated when the agency was created, and there is the general consensus that CBO has replaced OMB as the primary source for credible budget numbers. So focusing on the future, and the paper goes on to do this, and on these two factors, the budget resolution and reconciliation and CBO, I go on to ask three questions. The first is, can the budget resolution be rescued as a meaningful way for the Congress to affect fiscal policy? It goes without saying that this will not be true if the Congress simply does not, as has been true in about half of the last 20 years, adopt a budget resolution at all. One challenge here is that the budget committees, viewed as having limited power, are not necessarily that attractive for members to sit on. Some ideas that have been advanced to correct this problem are eliminating any term limits for membership and making the budget committees leadership committees composed of chairs and ranking members of other key committees. Second, there's the reconciliation process. The question is, has it been a positive development, and how might it be made more effective? Here there's a substantial difference of opinion between some people who say it should be abolished. These are by and large deficit hawks who see it as having made it much too easy to cut taxes and raise spending, and those who say that without reconciliation, as long as the filibuster survives, it represents the only way to get things done. In between these two extremes are a couple of other options, including requiring that reconciliation only be used for deficit reduction and removing some of the constraints of the Byrd Rule. For example, the Byrd Rule currently says reconciliation cannot be used to make any changes in Social Security. Third, given that CBO is considered to be, by most people, to be the success story of the 1974 Act, how can it be sustained as a source of nonpartisan information for the Congress? Here, the most important thing is for the Congress to continue to understand that it needs to strengthen and support CBO in spite of the inevitable disagreements that individual members might have with the agency's analyses. The budget committees have historically been particularly responsible in their protection of CBO because they understand that a weak CBO would weaken the Congress as a whole and the budget committees in particular. Power does, after all, abhor a vacuum, and a weakened Congress means a strengthened executive. So in closing, almost 35 years ago, political scientist Lou Fisher, who was then at CRS, opined that the Budget Act was asking the Congress to do something that is setting overall priorities rather than focusing on narrower interests, that it was just not well suited institutionally to do. He argued that the Congress was the wrong place to look for leadership on fiscal policy, and it was instead presidential leadership that was inclined to promote fiscal responsibility. To which I say maybe, but there are as many examples of fiscally irresponsible presidents as responsible ones. So regardless of whether you agree with Fisher's analysis or not, I think the failure of the Congress to routinely adopt budget resolutions and the degeneration of the budget resolution to a document that's solely used to score political points does not provide much of a counter to his argument. The Congress is now better informed and better able to operate on an equal footing with a given president. And if the reform has not led to anything resembling budget control, much less fiscal responsibility, and it has not, this is in large part because the budget resolution and budget committees have frequently not taken the opportunity to exercise their role in setting fiscal policy. If the Congress is going to play a credible role in forging a path for the budget, particularly given the projected future trajectory of the debt, it needs to take that role seriously. Otherwise, we may have to acknowledge that the 1974 Act, as Fisher predicted, is largely a failed experiment. So I thank you for listening, and I look forward to the panel discussions that follow. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Phil. The anniversaries sometimes turn into a lot of reflections on history. And this is a good occasion to do that, although I sometimes get a little anxious when people talk about 1974 as the good old days. But I also think that it's important to sort of see what we can learn from the past. It'll help inform us as we go forward. I think some of the conversations about the anniversary of D-Day, which is today, serve that purpose. It's not only celebrating the good things that were done in the past, the heroes, but thinking about how what we learned then can inform what we do now. So when Molly and I started thinking about this, we decided not to bring 100-year-old veterans of the budget process to the Brookings stage to talk about the good old days, but instead to put the past behind us and to look forward to the future about what are the challenges that the budget process broadly defined, not the arcana of the Senate versus House budget resolutions. What do we have to think about as we plan for the next 50 years? And so we invited three economists with different perspectives to help us think through these things and to identify what are the really big challenges that the society and thus the Congress and the White House face as we use the budget as to set national priorities. Anna Aizer is the Maurice Greenberg Professor of Economics at Brown. She does a lot of work on labor and health. She actually has, in addition to her PhD in economics, a master's in public health, and she's written a lot about the intergenerational transmission of poverty. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Doug Elmendorf, to whom Phil already referred, has an incredibly long resume, which would take 45 minutes to read. But right now, he's Dean and Don K. Price Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he was Director of CBO from 2009 through 2015. My colleague Sanjay Patnaik is the Director of the Center on Market and Regulation and Markets here at Brookings as the Bernard Schwartz Chair in Economic Policy Development. In addition to his PhD in economics, he has master's degrees in computer science and business engineering and is doing a lot of work on climate. So, Anna, I want to start with you. Surely one of the most important roles of any society is investing in its children. And by nature, any investment that we make in children today is not going to have much return in the 10-year budget window. So what do we know? How do we think about investments in children? What evidence is there that they actually pay off? And how do you think people who make budgets should think of them?
Okay, great question. So let me say that most of what we know about the returns to investing in children actually comes from evaluations of the major federal safety net programs, the Medicaid program, AFDC, and now TANF, the EITC, Head Start. These are all major federal safety net programs. And initially, when economists started evaluating these programs, they were really focused on what would happen to the parents' behavior. So if you gave a mother with dependent children cash, would she reduce her labor supply? Would she have more children? Would she be less likely to marry? Because all of these things might actually increase the benefits that she would receive from AFDC and now TANF. It was only until the 1990s, the late 1990s, that economists started saying, well, actually these programs were intended to benefit children. Maybe we should look at what happens to them and stop focusing so much on what happens to mothers' behaviors. And one of the first programs they evaluated was the Medicaid program. In particular, they looked at the expansions of Medicaid in the 80s and 90s. And they found that they had significant impacts on newborn health and child health. And that's great, but it doesn't necessarily have any implications for CBO. It's really only recently, like after the 2000s and 10s, that economists started looking at the long-term impact of, say, exposure to Medicaid either in utero or in early childhood. And recent work has been able to show that Medicaid, either in utero or early in childhood, leads to greater educational attainment. It leads to increased employment, greater earnings, less likely to claim EITC. And so now this has direct implications for the CBO because now we're really talking about hitting the federal budget, right? Increased revenue via taxes, reduced expenditures via reduced reliance on public support, either EITC or food stamps. And so we know that about Medicaid. We now know that about Head Start. We know that about food stamps. These are all programs that if you look long enough, you start to see pretty significant impacts on employment and earnings and tax revenue and reductions in reliance on public programs. However, I just want to make sort of 2 points about the importance of looking really long term. And I want to give 2 examples. Head Start. So if you actually look at the Head Start program, you evaluate the Head Start program, you find initial gains. Again, the Head Start program is the public preschool program for low-income children. Initially, you see some gains in test scores, but they fade. And so that led many to conclude, well, it's not so clear Head Start is worth it. But then if you follow those kids for longer, once they reach adulthood, then the returns are clearly apparent in terms of increased college enrollment, increased employment, reduced incarceration, et cetera. The other thing is sometimes when you're looking at something like health benefits, those are not going to be apparent until much later in life. So work training, youth training programs, for example, there have been 1 million evaluations of various youth training programs. For the most part, those effects on employment in the short and medium term are pretty modest. However, if you look much further out, so there's recent work looking at the impact of the first youth training program, which of course was the CCC during the Great Depression, which is the foundation actually for Job Corps. If you look at individuals who received job training during the CCC in the 30s and 40s, we now can follow them over their entire lifetimes. Like existing work training programs, very modest effects in the short and medium term, but over the lifetime, huge effects, right? You see that they are healthier, they live longer, they're less likely to claim disability, and they retire later. So these are all benefits that accrue much, much later in life, way beyond the CBO scoring window, but are very, very important because the estimates are extremely large. And then finally, I want to say another issue with respect to thinking about how to incorporate the benefits of programs that essentially invest in low-income children in their human capital, be it health or education, is that if we want to estimate these long-term benefits, we have to go pretty far back in time. And that raises the question, are the Medicaid expansions of, say, the 80s and 90s, would that be the same as expanding Medicaid today? And that is a much more complicated question. It requires a lot more sort of thinking, but I think it's very much worth it for economists to start thinking about how to generalize results that come from program expansions in the past to the current policy environment.
Let me ask you a couple questions. First of all, you speak with a great deal of confidence about the returns on these programs. What gives you so much confidence, and how do we set priorities among them? How do we know what is the most valuable kind of investment to make in children?
So I'm pretty confident in these estimates because they come from very large data sets. Most of these come from administrative data sets that capture the entire country. They're not small samples that are specific to particular places or individuals. They are very much generalizable to the population at large. And there should be a shout out to the federal governments, that the federal agencies that have really enabled this kind of research. So people at Census, people at Social Security, people at Treasury who are willing to work and collaborate with researchers because they are the ones that hold all the data on these kind of long-term adult outcomes that we care about, employment and earnings and disability claims.
Because you can track an individual.
Because you can track individuals. So we're pretty confident that these results are very strong and do generalize to the population more generally, but for that particular time period.
And how do you set priorities among them?
Well, there's a lot of work showing that investments in children more generally generate significant returns, and that's because you're affecting their human capital, right? Their education, their health. Not only that, those effects can have kind of modest effects annually, but since you accrue over such a long period of time, in the end, the effects are quite large. And there's actually a very nice paper that tries to do exactly what you're asking, which is calculate what we call the marginal value of public funds associated with these various programs, with the Head Start program, with Medicaid, food stamps. This is the Hendren paper and the QJE. And so you can see there, they actually try to do exactly what you're asking and say, what are the returns to these different programs? Which ones have higher returns than others? The general gist, though, is the early investments in children, really pay off.
Thanks. One of the reasons why we so much wanted Anna to come is that sometimes in Washington, investment gets boiled down to broadband and bridges. And I think the point that investing in children has an extremely high return, and probably, given some of the highways to nowhere, probably a higher return. Doug, if the point of economic policy and budgeting is to make life better for future generations, how do we equip the budget process and people who think about the budget so they are keeping that in mind as opposed to all the other things that seem to confuse them from day to day?
Well, thank you, David, for the question, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's great to be back at Brookings again. Our country faces a lot of challenges at home and abroad, but I want to focus on two where I think smart budget choices are especially important. So one challenge is we have an expanding federal debt. Right? We all know we have a very large gap between federal revenues and spending. Currently, federal revenues cover only about 3/4 of spending. We're just not collecting enough in taxes to pay for the programs and benefits that people want. And that gap will widen over time under current policy. That's the budget challenge. We also face a set of economic challenges, one of which is ensuring that we continue to have economic growth. Compared with other countries, the United States has done well in terms of economic growth over the past several years. But compared with our own past history, we're not doing so well. We have declining fertility and thus slower growth of the labor force than we've had traditionally. And we've had slower growth in productivity than we've had traditionally. And those pieces together mean that we have slower economic growth. And that's especially unfortunate at a moment when we also have people living longer, which is a good thing, but means that people are spending time not working and instead collecting Social Security and Medicare benefits. So policymakers need to make choices in coming years that will both spur economic growth and narrow the gap between spending and revenues. That's a tall order. It can be done. But to help get it done, Congress needs the best possible information about the consequences of the policy choices that it considers. An important way to improve the information that Congress has is for the Congress to ask the Congressional Budget Office and the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation to provide more estimates that incorporate all of the economic effects of proposed policies. In the jargon of the Washington budget world, that means providing more so-called dynamic estimates. When CBO and JCT provide estimates of the spending and revenue impacts of proposed legislation, they include the effects of many sorts of behavioral responses, but generally do not include the effects of changes in labor supply, capital investment, or productivity. Thus, while the estimates are hardly static, they also do not incorporate all of the dynamic effects that we can reasonably expect. And those omissions are not the fault of the agencies. The agencies are following long-standing tradition in budget analysis that has been supported by Congress. I argued a decade ago in a paper presented in this room that Congress should ask CBO and JCT to provide more estimates that include these additional economic effects. At the time, I said these dynamic estimates should be provided in only a small number of additional cases, primarily because I didn't think that providing them in more cases would be practically feasible. But times change. A distinguished economist named Heidi Williams recently prodded me to revisit this issue, and she and I and another distinguished economist, Glenn Hubbard, are writing a paper that we will present in September in this room about the issue of more dynamic analysis. Now, the paper is not yet written, so I cannot speak for them. I can only speak for myself. But I now think that dynamic estimates can and should be provided in a large number of cases. And in my mind, three important factors have changed since I wrote on this topic a decade ago. First, Congress faces key policy choices for which non-dynamic estimates of budgetary impacts are significantly misleading. One example for which Heidi Williams and I have already written a short article is changes in immigration levels of skilled workers. Second, there's now much more research that quantifies the effects of policy choices on labor supply, capital investment, and productivity. Anna summarized some crucial strands of this research regarding children, and there are other strands that we could talk about as well. And third, CBO and JCT have made substantial progress in developing models and frameworks that capture the effects of policy choices on these key economic measures more accurately and more comprehensively than in the past. This progress is much to the agency's credit and enables them now to incorporate these effects in more budget estimates. Let me make one final point. For some policy choices, as Anna said, significant effects on labor supply, capital investment, and productivity do not occur much, if at all, within the standard 10-year budget window. And there are reasons why 10 years is a standard that can be used in many cases. But CBO and JCT have enhanced their capability to provide estimates over longer time periods, albeit with even greater uncertainty than attends 10-year estimates. And I think that when policy decisions are being made for which long-term effects may be especially important, Congress should ask for long-term estimates from CBO and from JCT. So in sum, I think the time is ripe for CBO and JCT to be asked by the Congress to provide more dynamic estimates of legislative proposals. Such estimates can help Congress make smart budget choices to spur economic growth while narrowing the gap between spending and revenues. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Let me ask you, could you just elaborate for a moment on your reference to high-skilled immigration? If Congress passes a law that increases the number of high-skilled immigrants, how is that scored and why does that not make sense?
So what happens is if we admit more high-skilled immigrants to the country, they will affect the federal budget in two broad ways. Some of them will end up collecting federal benefits for one reason or another.
Like the ACA subsidies or something?
Like an ACA subsidy, yeah. Many of them will end up paying more will end up paying tax revenue. Because of the long-standing tradition of not including changes in labor supply in budget estimates, the additional labor supply of high-skilled immigrants isn't captured in budget estimates. So all that gets picked up is the effect on additional benefit receipt. And so the standard estimate of increasing high-skilled immigration shows a cost to the federal budget, even though, in fact, they would be a benefit.
Right. That means if you're doing something that's budget neutral, you have to pay for it, even though. All right. So I think obviously one reason that dynamic scoring got a bad name was the argument that if you cut taxes, it'll raise GDP and they'll pay for themselves. You're proposing that, and I think there's been some evolution since then, but what I'm wondering, there's a danger here that members of Congress will think everything they do is going to have a payoff in the long term, so we don't need to pay for it, and we'll end up making the debt worse. That requires a great deal of discipline on the part of JCT and CBO to say, no, Congressman, I know that you think that having every school kid exercise for 15 minutes a day is going to be good for them and it'll pay off in future tax revenues, but our evidence doesn't support that. How comfortable are you that we can maintain the discipline of CBO and JCT to A, make estimates without political favor, and secondly, to convey adequately the uncertainty that accompanies anything that's this long term?
So I think that CBO and JCT can and will continue to resist any political pressure. Of course, it is important, as Phil mentioned, for the budget committees, the leadership in the House and the Senate to stand up for an independent CBO and JCT staff, even when they don't like particular answers. And most of the time that has happened for 50 years, not quite every time, and that is a risk. But I think that it is so important to give nonpartisan objective estimates, even if people think that something more dramatic will happen. In some ways, it's most important if people think that a tax cut will pay for itself, to have a JCT estimate that takes account of the economic effects and says it won't pay for itself, rather than having JCT just say that's not in our scope to do estimates of. And for example, there have been a set of studies released in the last few months of what the broader effects would be of extending the expiring tax provisions. And the estimates show that only a small amount, somewhere between 0 and 15% of the cost, the direct cost extension, would be offset by the economic effects. It's way more useful to have that kind of information than to say not at all.
But your bottom line is that these things are always going to be abused by somebody, but on balance, we'll get better policy and we'll have more likely to have more economic growth and deal with the debt by doing more dynamic scoring than pretending we can't do it.
I think we'll have better sense of the budget effects, and we will have a better sense of the other consequences, which, as you noted, are the real goal of budget policy.
Right. So, Sanjay, when the Budget Act of 1974 was written, I'm sure there was somebody warning about climate change. I don't want to say that nobody was warning about climate change, so I'll get 16 emails citing someone's father who was warning about the climate change. But it certainly wasn't very high on the agenda. And now it is. And there's very little in the congressional budget process that weighs the climate costs of alternative legislation. So you've been working on a blueprint for how to do that, and here's your chance to explain how it's going to work.
Well, thanks so much, David, and thanks for the question, for having me. Yeah, so as you said, as climate change becomes more and more important, we will expect to see more proposals in Congress to address it, to decarbonize, to mitigate, and to adapt. And one key aspect of this we need to know, and decision makers need to know, what is the impact of such proposed legislation on carbon emissions, right? Because policymakers can make a lot of different choices. They can put a carbon price in place, they can put tax credits in place like they did with the IRA, and all these different choices have different impact on carbon emissions. So if a legislator comes in and says, look, I want to reduce emissions by whatever percent or whatever million tons, we need to know what kind of tools can get him there. And so currently we don't have a third-party, non-partisan, independent process that can do that. And I'll give an example why this is a problem. When the IRA was passed, we had obviously the scores from the JCT and the CBO on the fiscal impact of the tax credit and the expenditures, but then we had a lot of third-party estimates in modeling groups at universities and corporations that tried to estimate the emissions impact. And these two modeling suites, the energy models used by the third parties and then the models used by JCT and CBO, were not consistent. So what that led to is that the estimates for JCT and CBO of the fiscal cost, for instance, were about 400 billion around that time. The ones by the third parties that calculated both the emissions impact and the fiscal impact were 2 to 3 times higher on the fiscal impact. And so that's obviously the first problem. There is no internal consistency between that. And then second is, although a lot of these research groups have a deep expertise and they are at universities or think tanks, they have to make assumptions, and they don't have the same credibility like a non-partisan body would have, like the CBO has on fiscal scores. And so what we did is we launched a task force last year, and Doug has been helping with that a lot, to explore how could it look like if we had a carbon scoring effort at the federal level, situated in Congress, that could provide a non-partisan independent score on carbon emissions to start with, and we look at other expansions of proposed legislation that has major climate impacts. And so obviously, as you can imagine, that's quite complicated because these models vary widely, as we saw with the IRA. You have to make a lot of different assumptions. And so we are working with the task force, which is led by Jim Stock from Harvard and Meredith Fowley at Berkeley, to look at really kind of like each step, starting with like where should this effort be housed? What kind of scope of legislation should we look at? What kind of scores do we want? Maybe in addition to emissions, something else that could be useful. What kind of models and what kind of best practices for models should we look at? And then how should the institutional setup be resourced? What capabilities do you need? And specifically, if you don't have the capacity within the federal government, how can you get the expertise from outside to build that capacity up? And we have some spotty kind of efforts across the federal government. The EPA does some of that, or used to do at least, on an ad hoc basis, but we don't have a systematic approach to this. And so we are working on this and trying to really provide a blueprint, which we expect to release at the beginning of next year, that lays out exactly what we think how an effort like this could look like. And the CBO is obviously one place that we're looking at very closely for this.
And what's your timeline?
For the blueprint or for? Early January 2025, we plan to have the report ready and probably have an event on this.
And what do you think is the biggest challenge to creating a carbon CBO? What is the hardest part? I
think the hardest part is obviously it has to be very credible and non-partisan, like the CBO has been on fiscal scores. That has really been a strength. It has not been influenced by political consideration. And so with climate, this is obviously more challenging. As we know, climate is a bit more partisan than the topic itself. But I think when you think about it from an accountability perspective, that really appeals to both parties. And we have had conversations with both stakeholders from the Republican and the Democratic side, where we're saying, look, we need to know what the carbon impact is that is consistent with the fiscal impact that JCT and CBO come up with. And so that appeals actually to both sides because it's accountability. It's providing information that is important to have.
Doug, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what role do academic economists play in shaping CBO thinking about these big projects, both on the things that Anna and Sanjay have talked about?
So academic researchers are very important. CBO has panels of economic advisors and health advisors. And beyond that, reaches out to experts in every area in which CBO works. Some of that is specifically to read draft reports before they're released. Some of that is more general advice giving. CBO can't do the basic research itself as a general matter. It's relying on the perspectives of experts. And those experts make the analysis better. And then they also can speak to the caliber of the work that CBO does. So that interaction is incredible.
My understanding is that when there's a wide range of estimates on something, that CBO's strategy is to aim for the middle, not to decide who's right. Is that fair?
Well, yes. The way I would put it is that there is a wide range of possible outcomes of any policy, and often a wider range than people really understand and take to heart. And CBO's job is to be in the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes. That doesn't mean that CBO just takes every study that's out there and gives it equal weight and constructs some average. CBO reads research literatures carefully and puts more weight on studies that are more compelling and less weight on others, and then CBO talks with outside researchers to check that approach. But in the end, there's a lot we don't know about the world, and the world is always changing. And so there's going to be a very wide range. And I don't think there are very good ways to signal that uncertainty. Actually, I worried about this a lot with colleagues when I was at CBO, and I always found it really interesting intellectually and really disappointing at the end, because CBO would release a range of estimates, and people who wanted the number to be big would highlight the big number. People who wanted it to be small would pick the small number. The average journalist would call and say, I only have this many column inches. What number should I use? And I would say, well, just use the one in the middle, which we could have done a lot more easily than giving the range. And so I was always frustrated at inability to make people understand and take the uncertainty to heart. And that does speak to the issues that I'm talking about.
Right. I recall once we had a conversation on this stage about that with some people from the British government, and I think the Office of Budget Responsibility has some kind of color coding where they say on this particular estimate, we're very sure of X, that's green, we're not so sure of this, that's red, and so forth, right, is a way to convey uncertainty.
But I think the lesson of this is that for things like high-skilled immigration, we should at least get the sign right in the estimate.
Right.
And for issues of whether extending the tax cuts of 2017 will pay for themselves, we should understand there's a range of estimates, but the estimates are 0 to 15% offset through these broad economic effects. It's not 50% or 100% or 150%. Right. And I think as long as we keep in mind those broad gauge lessons, we're much better off with the information than without it.
Anna, how much interaction do you and your colleagues in academia have with CBO and members of Congress on this stuff?
So that's a good question. And actually, I recently had a conversation with folks at CBO, particularly about the Medicaid program. They wanted to think about how to incorporate these sort of long-term benefits that we now know accrue to children who are exposed to Medicaid early in life. And, we kind of talk through the kinds of things to think about. It's really complicated, again, because you have to sort of think, okay, the scenario in the 80s and 90s where most of the estimates come from,
right,
does that really translate to today?
How do we resolve that? I mean, I think the point is that when nobody had health care and you give people health care, you're going to have a lot of effects. Now lots of people have health care, so if you give another 100,000 people health care, maybe won't have that big an effect.
That's true, although medical care is now much more advanced, so you can actually purchase more with your health insurance than you could in the 80s. So it kind of goes both ways.
And do we have any idea that one of the things that the people at CBO said to us when we did this is, so it's great, you do this study that says that this expansion of Medicaid had this return and this increase in food stamps had that return. But we don't really understand the mechanisms. So when someone proposes something which is related to, but not exactly like what your research shows, if we don't understand the mechanism, how do we figure out what the return is? Is this just inevitable, or is there some way around this?
Well, I mean, I think there is now enough work sort of showing that health really matters, for example. Nutrition really matters. And so you can kind of reasonably, assume that programs that improve the nutritional intake of low-income kids in this country will improve their health. And there will be, it's a little bit of a daisy chain logic, but I think every piece is kind of there, and we're pretty sure about every piece.
And Sanjay, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about, do you sense a receptivity from Democratic and Republican politicians to have a kind of CBO-style impartial scorer on something that's become as politically polarized as climate change?
Yeah, for sure. As I said, we've really tried to reach out to both sides, and we also have people from both sides on the advisory council. We definitely see receptivity, and people, again, look at it from first from having the useful information, especially from a source that is more trusted, because with the IRA it was hard, it was a big time crunch, they had to rely on outside sources. And then I think also on the Republican side, it's really about efficiency and costs, right? Like they want to have accountability. How much will these emissions reductions cost? Is it worth it or not? So when you combine these two, there's definitely demand for that.
I see. So there isn't a very good official estimate now of what is the cost of the IRA per ton of carbon.
Emission, yeah, exactly, because the ranges are still quite wide.
Did you want to weigh in on it? Oh. All right. Let's take some questions. Can you bring the mics down to the front? There's two questions here, and there's one in the back. So let's start with these. You want to start here? And if you'd introduce yourself first, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, Bob Wyman. I mean, to a certain extent, we're talking about budgeting, but the focus in all the conversation always seems to be primarily on whether or not basically revenues and spending balance. You know, is there a deficit? Will there be debt, et cetera? But there's a school of economists, or growing perhaps, that argues that that isn't really the interesting question. The interesting question is something that hasn't even been mentioned today, and that is inflation. You know, what is the inflationary impact of the spending, whether or not there's a deficit, whether or not there's a debt. Now, it seems to me that even the CBO doesn't really ever substantively address that question of what is the inflationary impact. Now, I know we should be doing more dynamic, perhaps be doing more dynamic scoring. Inflation would be something which impacts very fundamentally all of the various dynamic impacts. How do we move forward to a place where we're dealing not only with sort of the traditional concern, you know, do we have a balance there, but also what is the impact in terms of inflation of what it is we're doing?
Mr. Federal Reserve, do you want to respond?
So, no, not the Mr. Federal Reserve here, but the CBO can do those estimates of effects on inflation and does on occasion. So when CBO does the analysis of the effects of big stimulus bills during recessions, the outputs include effects on GDP and employment and on prices. And when CBO does analysis of the effects of raising the minimum wage, they include channel through changes in prices. So that can be done. It's not always the central result of interest to the Congress, because the Federal Reserve generally adjusts its policies to keep inflation on target. So for most cases, the effects of changes in fiscal policy on inflation will be very, very limited. But there's nothing that takes it off the table. And CBO and the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation will be responsive to the questions that Congress asks of them. And if Congress elevates that as a question, then it will get more answers on that topic.
Thanks.
Mark Lerner. So the CBO makes all these predictions. Does anyone grade the CBO? Do we go back and say, well, were they right in all these predictions? And also, we haven't talked about deficit reduction. How do we get that?
So CBO grades itself. CBO releases reports that look at the accuracy of past projections. Of course, the challenge for any given piece of legislation is that lots of other things are happening at the same time. So if you ask whether CBO's analysis of the effects of the Affordable Care Act turned out to be right or not, you need to recognize that over the last decade, a lot of things have happened to the U.S. healthcare system in addition to the Affordable Care Act. So one of the challenges is it's very hard to, even in retrospect, to know if an estimate was right. But if you want to look at the accuracy of CBO's economic forecasts or revenue projections or what have you, CBO has reports on that on its website.
Right, and I think the answer to the deficit reduction thing is, as Doug said, obviously we cannot continue to grow the federal debt faster than GDP forever. And we're going to have to make some choices. And what we want to address in this panel today is when we make those choices about taxes and spending, how do we do it in a way that's likely to have the best impact on economic growth or on our other values, if it's distribution of income or something, and so that they're not all the same. Tax increases and spending increases of different kinds will have different effects, and we need to find a way to think about them so that we can understand those effects before we do them. Eli in the back, and then Louise in the front. Eli, why don't you bring, Alex, why don't you bring the mic up here?
Hi, I'm Terry Gallo. I agree that CBO
Hold the mic closer to your mouth.
I agree that CBO does a great job. They do, and as does JCT, they do a great job. And I also agree that more information is almost always better. I mean, as a matter of fact, when Doug was director, we increased or changed the rules a little bit on how we scored immigration to take account of increases in the labor supply. So I agree with that. The problem I see right now is that CBO and JCT, as wonderful as they are, barely have the time to do the job they're statutorily required to do. And Congress is no longer operating under normal order. CBO, the expectation is that CBO can turn cost estimates around on 1,000-page bills in a matter of days. So it's hard for me to imagine how adding carbon scoring and adding dynamic analysis across a much wider swath of estimates, practically speaking, how is that going to work?
Well, Sanjay, do you want to talk? I don't think your idea is that we should add this to CBO's current mandate without staff, right?
We would have to staff up, obviously. Otherwise, it
maybe
wouldn't be
a separate office.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I agree.
I would just say, for those who don't know, that Terry Gullo was one of the reasons that CBO has done such a terrific job in its work for decades. And so her concerns about the burden that's imposed relative to the staffing that's provided are quite important concerns.
Louise?
Thanks. Louise Shaner from the Hutchins Center. Just an idea. We do have a way of scoring things that have long-run consequences in the immediate. We have credit scoring, which for like a student loan, we wouldn't sort of say, well, we're going to get it paid back in the out years. And so, if you don't look at the out years. So is it possible to think, and I'm going to also, let's think about, notwithstanding the lack of resources at CBO, what BA does now when they have sort of new ideas that are sort of innovative and creative is they do a satellite account. And so could you imagine sort of moving towards a system where we do a very cash flowy kind of account, but then have this other measure that would be just the present value of the Medicaid costs, recognizing very rough because there's a lot of uncertainty and more uncertainty, but you could sort of score it in a way that would be immediate looking. And I just wonder if that's something to think about for your paper.
So that's very interesting. I've not thought carefully about how to best capture long-run effects. As you know, though, from credit scoring, the question of the discount rate is very, very consequential and not agreed upon by analysts. And so trying to turn these flows into present values raises additional questions, while it also does reduce to a simple sort of single set of numbers. I'm not sure what the answer is offhand.
Yeah, I think the other problem is the one you referred to earlier is when the BEA does a satellite account, the consumers of the BEA take that as something that's experimental. It doesn't show up in the headlines about GDP, probably doesn't move the markets. And the problem CBO has is that somebody will glom onto something and say, this is, you're contradictory here or something.
There is that risk. I mean, CBO often has in its cost estimates and other considerations section in which it opines on various things, sometimes qualitatively, can be quantitatively. But it is important, I think, because the CBO numbers can matter, it is important that they not be taken lightly internally or as they're put together, and that the right cautions need to be offered and the right explanations given. But I don't want to minimize the complications of that. And if I were the CBO director today, I would be particularly focused on the complications of that. At the same time, these are fundamental choices we're making about our society, and the straightforward ways of doing this now leave out critical information.
Yeah.
And I have to believe that we can do better.
Yeah. And how much of the work that you describe is possible now, not only because the federal government has allowed researchers to use all this anonymized data and Raj Chetty's putting together things, but it's simply just a matter of using technology more efficiently to analyze this stuff. Is this stuff that we couldn't have done in 50 years ago?
Yes, I think that's true. I think the bigger piece is the data. That's really been the major revolution in this space.
I mean, making the data available.
Making the data
We must have
available.
always had the data.
Yes.
Right. It was just available.
Yeah. the key thing now is sort of a lot of the programs that we're evaluating, when you're interested in these long runs, you got to go way back to the 60s and stuff like that. So that has been a challenge, working with these really old settings, linking it with modern data. And again, I really can't emphasize enough how important it is that the Social Security Administration and Census and Treasury have all really been on board and trying to really use their data to understand the impact of these programs.
I mean, I once met a economist at Northwestern, I think his name is Joseph Curry, who had done work on manuscript censuses that were 100 years old. And they figured out not only some way to machine read these written things, but to deal with the fact that the same name might have been spelled slightly differently from one decade to another, an F or a PH and stuff, and the machine learning helped them identify this is really the same person. So I think there is some.
So I think that's right. Yeah. So the machine learning has helped with the linking. Yeah, that's right.
Anybody else? If not, okay, please join me in thanking Doug, Sanjay, and Anna, and we'll move to the next panel.
Good morning. I'm Lisa Desjardins. I have the good fortune of working for the PBS NewsHour and also with regularly reading bills which require a very good relationship with CBO. So I'm happy that that is part of my job. I'm not sure every reporter would say that, but I am. In the last panel, David opened up talking about history. And obviously, today is a day where we remember important history in two different ways. I like to tell people, as a current congressional reporter especially, that I am very well aware that we are in a moment of history that will be interpreted, reinterpreted, looked at again and again in the future. I feel very fortunate to be here in a moment when I believe 50 years from now, people sitting in this room and other rooms will have wished to have been part of this kind of conversation and to be part of speaking to the lawmakers that I get to speak to, trying to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And that's why this conversation about the polarization, which is kind of a critical part of where we are today, I think is so important. To briefly introduce our panel, many of you already know them. Sarah Binder, senior fellow here, nationally recognized expert in Congress and the way Congress operates and sometimes doesn't operate. Also Professor at George Washington University. John Sides, leading expert on how Americans see themselves and what that tells us, from Vanderbilt University. And Molly Reynolds, senior fellow at Brookings, who studies Congress and also an expert in a key part of Congress, the rules of Congress, which have increasingly become a part, not just process, but of policy. Sarah, I want to talk to you about the budget process. We're looking ahead here at this panel. The budget process in recent years really has barely functioned, sometimes not functioned at all, deeming resolutions. I talk to members of Congress who sometimes don't even understand budgeting versus appropriating, basic sort of functions here. There are voices who want a more firm and consistent way, clearly, on budgeting. How do you see the landscape ahead for the budget process, especially given the polarization we have right now? Do you think there are factors that could change it or cement it as it is now?
Sure. So first, thanks very much for including me. I think one way, or the best way, to approach the question about the future of the budget process is to look backwards just very briefly to kind of benchmark where we came from. And two core features of that early 1970s stand out to me. One that Phil emphasized at the outset: presidents, not Congress, made fiscal policy. Lawmakers, of course, passed spending bills and tax bills, but fiscal policy was piecemeal, haphazard, right? No congressional role, no budget resolution, no, as we know, no CBO, and a very aggressive President Nixon who impounded funds whenever he didn't want to spend them. Second, more importantly, I think for our panel, is from today's perspective, the party system was just unrecognizable, right? Both parties were ideologically diverse, voters split their tickets, and of course Democratic majorities as far as the eye could see going backwards and anticipating going forwards. Why does that matter if we're thinking about going forward? Lawmakers who wrote the Budget Act assumed that bipartisan and bicameral majorities would exercise and protect this new congressional role in making fiscal policy. But obviously, that's not the world that we live in. We know, polarized parties, that is, ideologically disagreeing with one another, even when they're factionalized within one party in particular. We have partisan team play. Your team's for it, so my team's against it, even if we took the opposite position several years before. Less powerful committees, including obviously the Budget Committee, more powerful or involved leaders, and lawmakers, most of whom seem not to care very much about protecting Congress's power of the purse. And of course, today's national debt, a much greater proportion of GDP than it was 50 years ago. But I think that's the core challenge when we think about could there be changes, or are we just sort of cementing what came in the past? I really don't expect much immediate change in the budget process. On the discretionary spending side, we need not just bipartisan, bicameral, but we need supermajorities, and those, as we all know, are very hard to build. Instead, Congress just kicks the can down the road as long and as often as it can until it creates a crisis to try to force action, which doesn't always yield the deals that you might if you thought more thoroughly. On the tax side, one party in particular is committed not to raising most taxes. On the entitlement side, neither party seems to have an incentive, right, to address future sustainability of programs, Medicare, Social Security in particular. Like, why impose costs on your voters today for benefits that won't be anticipated or realized until the future, assuming a future majority doesn't undermine the choices that you make today. So there is a day of reckoning, obviously coming for Social Security, probably in a decade, to force Congress's hands. And the longer they wait to get there, and they will wait until a crisis, like
that's your conclusion. That they will not take even small actions.
No, and the longer you wait, those incremental changes are off the table because you have a crisis to solve. So I'll be Eeyore today. I'm not looking so good. Eeyore on every day.
It's a healthy environment for Eeyores, unfortunately.
As it were.
Yes. So, Molly, I want to ask you about this, the polarization, but also the animosity, how this gets reflected in rules on Capitol Hill and the process. And what do you think this means? Can there be any change ahead given this polarization and especially like very raw animosity that I still feel at the Capitol?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there are a couple different ways to think about it, depending on sort of what component of the budget process we're talking about, what time horizon we're working with. But I think to start, when we think about what I'd call the annual kind of blocking and tackling of the budget process, I think these sort of ruthless partisan dynamics in Congress are a major factor in why it's really difficult to get things done as prescribed. And I want to emphasize the as prescribed part of this, and because we can talk about this. I think there's a real question about whether the current process is the right fit for our current politics. When we think about process changes, do we need to think about changes that kind of align better with the partisan incentives that members face? But thinking, for example, about the annual budget resolution, and Phil did a nice job of summarizing this in his opening remarks, the budget resolution was designed to give Congress this opportunity annually to sit down and set a big picture fiscal blueprint, and it's not that anymore. It can't be filibustered, which also means that, particularly in the Senate, some of the leadership's usual tools for limiting amendments to it aren't as readily accessible, which in turn means that we get lots of messaging amendments and really just lots of amendments, period, which members really don't want to sit through unless they have to. It's also the case that divisions within the parties, and Sarah mentioned this a little bit, can disincentivize members from wanting to vote on a budget resolution unless they feel like they have to. So all of this means that really Congress isn't using this mechanism for setting the overall fiscal blueprint. I think we see a similar dynamic playing out with the annual appropriations bills, where the fact that those are one of a few things that Congress reliably still works on every year means that they've also become really popular targets for all kinds of amendments. We have a number of examples from the past decade or so of bills that had to get pulled from the floor over amendments that either some faction of the majority party didn't want to vote on, or where an amendment had been adopted and was going to end up as a sort of poison pill that would jeopardize passage. We can see this happening between the parties. We can see it happening within the parties. I think over a longer time horizon, thinking about the kinds of policy challenges that the first panel discussed, some of these macro dynamics that I think Sarah also mentioned are really make this hard. So we have this era, we're living in an era with frequent episodes of divided government, but also with narrow majorities. And when a party is in the minority, it thinks that the majority could often be in reach after the next election, contrary to the sort of era that we were in the early 70s. And so this makes it hard for majorities to make tough choices, lest they be punished. Though I think John will sort of talk about what the public opinion data tells us about this reasoning. But also it's hard to, in situations where a bipartisan deal might be productive, the minority is often reluctant to give the majority a win. And so I think all of those dynamics together really illustrate kind of how the current partisanship in Congress is making it really difficult to address these problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John, let's get to that, what we know about the public and how this weaves in. You know, the Abraham Lincoln quote, public sentiment is everything, really has been bouncing around the Capitol a lot. Nancy Pelosi liked to use it. She credited a different member from raising it. And it got me thinking, too, I want to go back into, as I put it, the Wayback Machine. And remember Ross Perot? Remember 1992? When budgeting and the deficits were sexy, and launched him into a very serious presidential bid. Where are we now in terms of how Americans see, do they care, how much do they care about budgeting dysfunction, and the gridlock that is around it?
The short answer is not very much. The American public does not like the budget deficit or the federal debt. That's no surprise. The debt and the deficit have been negatively stigmatized in American politics and political culture since the founding of the country. So if you ask people in a survey, you know, how important is this list of issues, and for each one you can say how important you think it is, and one of those things is the federal budget deficit. You know, most people say that's somewhat or very important. But there's, I think, a couple reasons to think that that is, to a significant extent, lip service. One is that if you ask people a different kind of question, which is just, what do you think is the most important problem facing the country? And then they can give you an answer in their own words. It's very, very rare for the budget or the deficit to ever be mentioned by anyone at any point, relative to concerns like inflation or immigration. Sometimes, sort of broadly speaking, people mention things related to the government leadership, but what they have in mind there is, I don't like the president. Not so much, I'm concerned with the breakdown of the fiscal policy-making process in Congress. When they do tend to cite the budget and the deficit, it is not a function of the actual fiscal health of the country. It is a function of whether there is a very prominent and highly publicized episode of government dysfunction, especially shutdowns. Not every shutdown creates a little uptick in the percentage of Americans who cite issues related to the budget or to the deficit, but that seems to be the catalyst. So what you want of Americans is to be like careful barometers of the debt clock, you know, that you can find online or in New York City, they won't do that. The other challenge, I think, with the public's attention to the deficit is that it is strongly influenced by their own partisanship and in the way you would expect. Democrats care more about the deficit when the Republicans are in the White House, and Republicans care more when the Democrats are in. So you may have seen there was a Pew Research poll that came out in the last couple of weeks. It was based on survey data from May, and they did the whole, here's a list of things, is a big problem, a very big problem. And the percentage of Republicans who said that the federal budget deficit was a, quote, very big problem was 71%. And the percentage of Democrats who said that was 35%. And two scholars who have written an article about this came up with a name for this pattern, which I wish I had invented myself: deficit attention disorder. So, I mean, for those,
AD.
yeah. So for those reasons, I think that it's challenging to expect the American public to be like the catalyst, right, for changes, not just to, well, certainly changes to the budget process, of which Americans know very little, but even to budget policy.
But it's to your point, though, that when this gets in the headlines, when there's a big moment of dysfunction, is there any way to know, this is a chicken and egg question, but is there any way to know, is it an issue of an innate sort of lack of caring about these kinds of issues about the deficit, or is it that leaders in Washington themselves don't really want to talk about it? They themselves are culpable here, and they aren't offering a lot of solutions. If there was more talk about it from leaders, would the public change?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, people like to blame the public about this kind of stuff. I have a Kent Conrad quote, if you want it, from like 2011. I think the biggest impediment to doing what has to be done is public opinion. Okay, and he goes on and tell you why Americans won't do the things that are required to deal with the deficit. Maybe that's right, but the fact of the matter is, if you look at elections, this is like let's let people's preferences be their revealed preferences, not their sort of like survey responses where they can say nice things and there are no consequences. You know, if you look at presidential elections, down ballot elections in states, you know, they're just not that like strongly related to how well the fiscal balance of the federal or state governments are doing. And I think it's exactly a function of what you said. Like, people, in order to vote on an issue, people need information about that issue. People are misinformed about the budget, the way that we're all misinformed about lots of things in life and politics. And so if politicians aren't talking about it, so how are we supposed to know what's going on, what's the problem, why is it important, what are you proposing to do about it, what are you not proposing to do about it, what are they proposing to do about it? And when that doesn't happen, it shouldn't be any surprise that the budget doesn't rise to the top of people's minds when they're in the ballot box. You can find exceptions to that, and I think Perot's a good example of sort of raising the salience of something. And you know, he had the benefit, right, of like striking when the iron was hot, when we had like a 19...
And a lot of money for TV ads.
Yeah, I know. He could get up there and be like, I want to get right to the heart of the bullseye of the matter, you know, and he'd show you like a chart. I worked on that impression. It doesn't work with students anymore.
Oh no,
so
that
I
was
get to
solid.
use it with you guys.
Best Perot impression I've seen in a long time.
Some of you will remember. But he came in an era where there were deficits, right? Now, there had been like the 1990 Budget Act, right? There had been efforts to rein that in, of which, of course, was the famous tax increase that, like, you know, made life hard for H.W. Bush in the Republican primary in '92. But still, like, there were like deficits were sort of a surprise. Like, we had been dealing with them. I mean, there had been episodes of deficits in the past, but really only since 1980 had we really seen significant deficits. And so, you know, those moments don't come along that often. And now I think politicians are quite habituated to it. There's no reason for them not to be. Like, we've been living with deficits for a long time. There hasn't been like a major crisis. Now, there's going to be differences in this room about how much of a crisis we have faced or are facing. But I'm just saying, like, when the dollar is the reserve currency and people buy treasury bonds, there's no real crisis that would force policymakers to make a 180-degree turn. At the state level, sometimes you can see little, like, Ross Perot-ish episodes. And my favorite example of this, to cite another example that, you know, only folks in this room will remember, is the Sam Brownback budget, and when he was the governor of Kansas. And Brownback achieved what I thought it was, in retrospect now, like a remarkable, like, how to do the most unpopular things on both the tax side and the spending side simultaneously. Now, he sold it as a tax cut that would, you know, give money to people and would be paid for with spending cuts. And the reason this became a political albatross is because a bunch of leaders in the state, including former budget directors, state legislators, angry parents in the Kansas City suburbs, stood up and said, wow, what's happening as a consequence of this budget? Rural hospitals are having to close. Music programs in schools are having to cut. And I want my kids to know, do, re, mi. The budget directors went around the state doing like a road show that would make like a Brookings type institution proud to show you what had happened. On the tax side, the law enabled wealthy people to create LLC pass-throughs. And one of the people that had an LLC pass-through was the most famous person in the state of Kansas, which is not a politician, but is who? The coach of the University of Kansas basketball team, Bill Self. Now, Bill Self did not have an LLC pass-through as a consequence of the law. It predated the law, if memory serves me. But nevertheless, when a person is the highest paid state employee, as all college sports coaches are in most states, right? Higher than the governor, higher than anybody. When he's benefiting, so you've run afoul of the government, of the public's defense of popular spending programs, and you've run afoul of their sense of fairness about who pays taxes. And the public cares much more about the fairness of taxes than the exact dollar amount that they have to pay. This is Vanessa Williamson's work, another person here at Brookings. And so, there was a moment where I felt like, and I went to Kansas and I talked to some of these folks, including Laura Kelly when she was a state legislator, now she's the governor. But that took a lot of work to sort of educate the public. Some of them could see it, right? You could sort of, I know my kid's music program has been cut, but how do you translate that into a disapproval of the incumbent governor and then a vote against that person? So that's what it takes.
Molly, you raised reconciliation. This is, as we see, as you're saying, there are not a lot of vehicles for getting anything done in Congress. You also had a really funny post on X about how you've reached your own personal, how did you put it, your own personal benchmark to determine if 2025 reconciliation is happening? And I'm surprised that I'm hearing too. Steve Scalise was talking about his plans for reconciliation, assuming they keep the majority. It's quite some thinking. What is your evaluation? And we know what an important vehicle this is of the budget reconciliation ahead, how it will be used in the next couple of years and then farther out.
Sure. So first I want to say that sort of looking ahead to a possible 2025 reconciliation bill, this is entirely consistent with one of, I think, the points, the really perceptive points that Phil makes in the paper about the way that reconciliation has evolved into what I sometimes call the sort of one neat trick that majorities have under unified party control to try and pursue their goals. And you're right, Lisa, that we've started to see some reporting about what Republicans might do if if they enjoy unified party control in 2025. I'll note that this idea of talking about this in advance is not new. And we might actually argue that the current Republican conference in Congress is a little bit behind the eight ball. So in 2015 and 2016, congressional Republicans passed a repeal of the Affordable Care Act that they knew was going to be vetoed by President Obama, but via reconciliation, in part to figure out in advance what of their policy goals in the context of ACA repeal would and would not be blessed by the Senate's parliamentarian, who is responsible for, among other things, advising on what is permissible under the Byrd rule, which I think as probably everyone in this room knows, cabins what is allowed through the reconciliation process. It was during that 2015 experience that we learned that, for example, an outright repeal of the individual mandate under the ACA was not permissible in reconciliation, but you could set the penalty for noncompliance with the individual mandate to zero, and that was okay. And ultimately, when Republicans pursued that very particular policy goal, that's the avenue they took. And so obviously right now we have divided party control, so you would not see a reconciliation bill make it to the president's desk for a veto, but you could imagine something more like, more sort of working it out in advance than even kind of we are right now. And then the last thing I'll say is that, again, this kind of initial reporting that we've heard suggests that Republicans' approach might be, in terms of breadth, more like what Democrats did with the American Rescue Plan and Build Back Better than what Republicans did with the ACA repeal. I mean, that it might be broad, it might cover lots of policy areas rather than narrowly focused on kind of a single key policy priority. And I'll note, because in part because this is an event looking back at history, in some ways, this is consistent with a much older model of reconciliation, one that included lots of committees. In the 80s and the 90s, reconciliation bills frequently included, if not all of a chamber's committees, many of them. The impetus there was the idea that when reconciliation bills were consistently used for deficit reduction, you brought all the committee, you implicated all the committees in the process. Everyone had to share the pain of making cuts to programs in their jurisdictions, and that's how you sort of got everyone to be willing to hold hands and jump. Now, I think but then when we got to the point of doing the American Rescue Plan and the initial Build Back Better proposal, which we all know transformed into the Inflation Reduction Act, then we were talking about a deficit increasing bill, and so it was more about everyone getting a piece of the pie than everyone sharing some of the pain. I think the political dynamics of a big sort of omnibusy reconciliation bill under unified Republican control would be really different. I want to be clear about that, in that there are a lot of mandatory spending programs that I think Republicans would be game to cut or restrict, but it does sort of open up this possibility of intra-committee competition in a way that I don't think we quite saw when the last time Republicans had unified party control and we were talking about using it for first ACA repeal and then for the 2017 tax cuts.
Yeah, we could spend a long time about this shifting power of committees and the committee structure, committee chairman and women, and how that's been changing back and forth. Sarah, I want to ask you, I know that you wrote back in the day, or back in 2021, about the decision by the parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough. That's a woman who's had a high-pressure job recently, to tell Democrats that they essentially, at that point, would only have one bite at the reconciliation apple. And we can get into, I know there are many in this room who know that there are several ways you can approach reconciliation. Realistically, the way it's been working in Congress, though, is that there's been one, and they attempted two that year. I want to ask you, in this era of polarization, there's also a lot of talk about the filibuster in theory. There's also a lot of talk about somebody getting the majority, 50+1, and doing what's called some kind of nuclear rule, either getting rid of the Byrd rule or changing the budget process just to make it easier for reconciliation. Do you see any of that in the cards? I know you don't see the process as it is, things moving forward.
It's a good question. First, within the budget, there are context, and then more generally, I mean, in this world of gridlock and deadlock, the name of the game is often just like stretching the rules, like finding, like they're on the books, but find new ways and new purposes to use the old rules. And reconciliation is like such a great example of just like how plastic these rules are, right? But of course, well, we can go into why or origins of reconciliation was just like, a little cleanup at the end of the process till it becomes like the name of the game today, right? The question then is, can it be stretched even further? Like, could majorities find a new way to stretch it so that you can basically not even worry so much about the fact that on other issues you're constrained by the filibuster? Can we stretch it to the breaking point? I think it depends on a couple of things. First, on our discussion about the sort of independence and the nonpartisanship of the CBO director, there's also the nonpartisan Senate parliamentarian, God bless her soul, right, holding the line against ambitious parties on both sides of the aisle. So first, like, how long can that model persist? I don't want to be struck down by the Association of Parliamentarians anywhere, of which I should be a member.
They like the acknowledgement of the task they have.
I do like to tell people that I am the Senate parliamentarian, but I am the faculty Senate parliamentarian, where the fights are really, really tough.
It's the worst job, I think.
Oh, it's a lot of fun. So first, like, how long can that model persist? Second, like, and related, like, how long will senators defer to the parliamentarian? And to some degree, there's an electoral incentive to defer to them because you can blame poor Elizabeth McDonough when they're protesters on the Golden Gate Bridge. Third, is there some exercise of forbearance, right? That, yes, we could blow through the Byrd Rule, we could we could go to majority vote to overturn Byrd Rule calls and so forth. But do you restrain yourselves? Do you stuff all those appropriations bills into reconciliation, or you just say, we're not going to do it? I don't think they're ready to quite blow up the Byrd Rule because of the value of some sort of blame-avoiding technique. But I think outside that, outside the budget context, I wouldn't be surprised the next trifecta of Democrats, if there were more Democrats, to try to narrowly create an exception to the filibuster to pursue some of these policy issues that otherwise have to be squeezed into the Byrd Rule.
With all these issues, sort of how much do you use bare-knuckled or scorched earth tactics in the Senate? Am I wrong to think of it as Trump era versus post-Trump era, and we really don't know what that looks like? Is the Trump sort of tactics of it all governing, do you think, the way senators, especially but House members we know, go about process?
I would fall in the camp that despite the fireworks of the Trump era, and despite how many questions Molly and I got, and we're not looking forward to the next round, can he do that? Right? That's a lineage of transformation of the Republican Party, a long transformation in which the base has just been out of sync with elites and establishment of the party. So these difficulties they're going to have those difficulties regardless of Trump. And the Trumpian point here, the question is like the Trump term, clearly there was enough establishment, there were the Mitch McConnells of the world that were willing to ignore Trump when he said he didn't know what it meant, but to nuke the filibuster. Whether or not that Senate Republican Party has been totally magnified, that I think is what I keep my eyes on.
It is, I think my personal observation is at this moment, the House Freedom Caucus is in descendancy, the Senate Freedom Caucus is in ascendancy. So the dynamics are changing quickly. I'm sure they'll change again, probably by the time we finish this panel. But John, when is it that the public punishes politicians, lawmakers especially, for deficits, for bad budgeting, for these kinds of decisions that the public says they don't want?
Rarely, if ever. I mean, I think that we could come up with, fiscal policy ideas that in the abstract, like taken one by one, would be relatively unpopular. And if a politician decided to that was what I wanted to do, yeah, you could probably pay a cost the way that Sam Brownback paid a cost. But I think it's difficult for the public to think holistically in the way that we so often want the congressional budget process to think holistically. One of the issues that arises when you try to do this is, you ask the public questions about spending and taxes, and it's easy to do that in ways that elicit what we think of as free lunch kind of thinking. Like, do you want to pay more in taxes? No. Do you want to maintain or increase levels of spending in this area, this area, this area, this area? Yes, 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 yes. Foreign aid, no. Another area, yes, yes, yes. But on the other hand, if you guys have raised children, you never say, "What do you want for dinner?" And they're like, "Pizza," But you say, "Do you want pasta with spinach or sweet potatoes and chicken?" And they're like, And then you've given them two healthy options to choose between. So if you give the public healthy options in a survey, they can reason and make trade-offs. And there's lots of survey data on this. There's lots of exercises, deliberative exercises that have been done, including by sort of deficit hawkish groups to elicit this kind of thinking. You can play these little online budget games that people like to create, different organizations that created those are super fun. So public can do it. But if you're not being asked to do it, like if the politicians are not giving you the equivalent of the menu question that I would ask of my kids for dinner, then you wouldn't expect the public to get there on their own and then be able to sort of judge politicians by what is the relative trade-offs that they would make in this party versus what would the trade-offs be made
right.
in that party. That's where I think the challenge arises. The other issue, if you really want to get into the big challenge, because this was alluded to a moment ago, is what does the public really want to do to cut the deficit? Okay, what would they do? They would, typically speaking, make life harder for wealthy people. They would raise their taxes and cut their benefits. Like you could make the Social Security income threshold higher or whatever. Where is the appetite for that? Where's the appetite for that in the Republican Party? There's no appetite for it. That was already said. Where's the appetite for that in the Democratic Party? Well, what's Biden's stated threshold for the tax cut?
$400,000.
$400,000. I mean, in other words, you can make almost 8 times the median income and not have your taxes cut. So, people get mad at the public, but we get mad at the public because when they haven't been given the choices that incentivize them to make trade-offs, and then when they do make the trade-offs, politicians don't like the answer and so they ignore it.
It's funny you're saying about giving the public healthy options to choose from when you're asking their opinion. I really have a problem with approval ratings of politicians, especially in the modern era when so many politicians are so unpopular. To me, it's almost, I put it this way, it's almost like, do you approve of this jelly donut? Well, yes, I do approve of it. Should I eat it is a different question. Is that what I want for dinner is a different question. Molly, I'm going to try and sneak in just a couple of minutes because I want to give time for audience questions. A question about Social Security and Medicare entitlements. What do you see as the future there in this? We heard from Sarah, not an Eeyore, I guess, prognostication about what's ahead. Do you see any chance for, even small efforts at making this easier rather than the hardship that we see ahead?
Yeah, I think as Sarah put it before, there is at this point little immediate pressing incentive to act. There's nothing. At some point that will come, but right now it's easier to shirk because there's nothing forcing members to act. I do also sometimes wonder if if we're using today to make a list of the unintended consequences of reconciliation, I also wonder if one of the consequences of the increasing reliance on reconciliation is that members have gotten very used to doing things temporarily. Because of the nature of the way the process is constrained. And then they have this expectation that at some point in the future, a cliff will force them to act again. And sometimes this works, and sometimes it doesn't. I would point towards the temporary expansion of the child tax credit when many people thought, you do that temporarily in the intermediate time, it becomes really popular, and then members will never want to take it away, and that's decidedly not what happened. I also, and Phil mentioned this earlier, think the fact that Social Security can't be touched by reconciliation adds another layer of kind of Congress's muscles aren't there because increasingly the way that they have touched mandatory spending is through reconciliation, and that's a mandatory spending program. They can't touch the reconciliation. And so I think, and then sort of add on top of this, just the really significant turnover in the membership of the House and the Senate. And so the number of members who have ever tried to cut a meaningful deal on entitlements is very small. And the sort of recent attempts at big fiscal compromise for other political reasons have had a really hard time sticking. See the Fiscal Responsibility Act, see the Budget Control Act. So there's just the muscle memory really isn't there. And so you add that into the piece about the fact that there's no immediate incentive to act, and it's just really hard for me to see change before, as Sarah put it, change absolutely needs to happen.
Okay. Who has questions in the audience? There you go. They'll bring the mic to you. And again, introduce yourself, and if there's an affiliation you want to raise, that's great. Anybody? Yes, there you go. Oh, wait, sorry, right here in the green shirt.
Hi there. My name is Jennifer Wheelock, and Sarah, I actually benefited from you speaking to our Stennis group of congressional fellows, senior congressional staff. So it was great to see you again today. But my question, kind of, you and Molly both laid out very well that the era in which we created CBO and some of the institutions is very different now in terms of the bipartisan, bicameral sort of incentives to have a functioning budget process and entity to support that. And so I'm curious, in your view, what kinds of things, what kinds of tools institutionally might be available to Congress rather than just relying on our goodwill and good sense? What other tools might be available to Congress institutionally to strengthen places like the CBO and the Senate parliamentarian or others that we rely on? Sarah?
So that's a great question. And I guess with always the caveat that the rules reflect the priorities of the players. And so the one question is, like, even if we can come up with a set of structural design here, the likelihood of the two parties willing to implement it, that's the higher hurdle. I think what I would take away from the CBO example here, and obviously Doug knows it better than I do, is just sort of the interlocking ways in which they set up the directorship, the 4-year terms, I'm sure Bill knows it better than I do too, right? The ways in which which budget chair, which chamber, which party gets to make the appointments. Just sort of a set of interlocking things that aren't neatly timed with changes in the unanticipated, and you don't know the uncertainty of which is going to be the new majority. So finding ways to institutionalize appointments, in particular, in ways that would protect it and not align it with the cycles of elections, I think perhaps that's one way to think about it. But of course, then, as we've talked about with CBO, staff funding streams are subject to the legislative appropriations process. I don't think this ever happens, but some sort of trust fund for those types of internal staff positions might work.
Yeah, the second thing Sarah said is where I was going to start, and the first panel talked about this a little bit, but just ensuring that CBO has the staff and analytic capacity that it needs to be able to do both its sort of current scope of work, and certainly if we are interested, as I think we should be, in improving the quality of information that flows into the budget process in the ways that our first set of panelists talked about, I think ensuring that they're well staffed and well resourced is a really important piece of it too.
Josh Gottbaum, Brookings. Phil, basically each panel has mentioned that Social Security and entitlements were kept out of the reconciliation process, and as a result, Congress has been able to kick the can down the road and avoid dealing with that very difficult trade-off. You've mentioned that there is a possibility at some point that maybe the filibuster rule goes away, or maybe, et cetera. But given the fact that the three of you are actually experts in how the Congress acts, would you speculate for a minute, if in fact the filibuster were eliminated, would the Congress, under what circumstances would the Congress actually take on the question of entitlements? Would they, what's your scenario if that might happen?
Molly?
Sure. So first I'll note that reconciliation can be used and has been used copiously to make changes to other entitlement programs that aren't Social Security. But I think when we think about the potential future abolition of the legislative filibuster or the continued narrowing of it, I think it's important to remember that the rules aren't magic and that they can't force agreement where underlying agreement doesn't exist. And I think the 2017 Affordable Care Act repeal experience is probably the best example of this that we have. Republicans could not get that over the finish line, not because they were contending with a 60-vote threshold, but because the combination of the strictures of the reconciliation process and their reasonably small majority in which there were divisions on what ACA repeal should look like meant that they could not get to yes. It was not fundamentally a problem of the 60 vote threshold. And so when we look ahead to, again, this potential future worlds where we have a narrowed or no legislative filibuster, then we have to ask ourselves, what are the political dynamics that a majority party would face in that situation? And on this issue, there's still against action. The incentives to cut benefits, to raise the amount of revenue that's coming into Social Security, the incentives are not in favor of doing that, regardless of whether we're talking about having to do it with 51 votes or 60 votes.
I would just say that thinking about the politics of what that would look like if there were different rules and maybe a different appetite for dealing with this challenge. And this is a comment that I think will maybe be a very modest antidote to the Eeyore-ish tendencies of Sarah and
certain experts.
I know it's a birthday party. I know. I'm sorry.
I don't. Who was the happy character in Pooh? Was it Pooh?
Yeah, Piglet.
Tigger.
Oh yeah, Tigger. All right. So this is like a little teaspoon of Tigger. When elites reach a relative degree of consensus, public tends to follow along. When elites polarize, the public polarizes. When elites can get together, get a compromise together, public tends to go along. So what I would envision, right, in this hypothetical world, which Molly's already dumping cold water on, but this hypothetical world where in order to sort of save Social Security, that's the branding, right? You have to raise taxes and or cut benefits, or what was the Obama era debate that seems so quaint now? Which version of CPI do we use to calculate cost of living? Chain CPI? Yeah. We go through all that again. But I think if it's presented to the public with some degree of bipartisan consensus, there'll be a tax from, maybe this will be a center against the ends kind of coalition or something, I'm not sure. But I think it can survive public opinion. I don't think you would say, oh, Social Security is a third, people will say this, but Social Security is a third rail, you can't touch it, stop. No, we have touched it and we can touch it, but the circumstances under which that agreement is reached matters a great deal. And I think that's the path forward. I don't know exactly what shape that will take, but I don't think that you would expect, if you had a 2/3 or 3/4 majority of Congress vote yes on that compromise, it's going to disappear from the headlines and the public's not going to think about it anymore. The same way that we're not thinking about the compromises that Congress has already reached, even in this Congress, because once the vote happens and it's done, and Marjorie Taylor Greene can squawk or whoever, but it's done. And I don't see on Ukraine aid or anything, some little tidal wave, coming to shore where the politicians are going to pay a cost. Because they were able to get that consensus together.
I'm going to try and sneak in 2 more questions. I'll say your exact idea worked in West Wing. They did it there.
But it's funny. It seems West Wingish to say it, but honestly,
there is an actual episode.
I can hand you a very thick and boring political science book called "The Nature and Origins of Mass Opinion," full of graphs and other tedium, right? That like all scholarship, right? My scholarship too. It makes this point, right? One-sided flow of information. Democrats and Republicans agree. Public opinion tends to side with that, especially if you're paying attention to politics and you know what the consensus is.
Because I want to try and get into 2 more questions. If we keep it quick. Yes, sir, in the front row, and then I'll go in the back. Yes.
You got to get Poland.
Oh, sure. Right there. Okay, absolutely. We'll go right there.
Yeah, given that there's polarization and pretty much an even split, it seems to me, leadership becomes much more important, and what the members know, frankly, or what they think becomes less important. In a world like that, do rules like the Budget Act, does work like that, which is being done by the CBO, does become less important and less useful? In other words, what is the impact of polarization on the utility of the things we're talking about here?
Yeah.
Well, so long as members want to get reelected, to pursue any other goal, even if it's just reelection, they are ultimately invested in what Congress does. And what leaders can do is constrain by what those members are willing to let them do. And so there's only so far you can get before you run up against the Budget Act and so forth. It's just very hard to get around those rules of the game. So I think the centralization and the growth of leadership power here is important because it lets these members off the hook from knowing anything about the details. But at the end of the day, these leaders need their votes. And so they need a way to explain it, to rationalize it, and to make it for members to think that it's in their interest to vote for it.
Let's go right, obviously there. Go over in the back.
Thank you. Bill Hoagland, one of those 100-year-old budgeteers that David talked about. Thank you very much. Very enjoyed the conversation. The next 50 years, I guess I haven't heard today what you really think the next 50 years should look like. I probably won't be around to enjoy it, but let me just ask, both Sarah and Molly, you said the political system that was set up in 1974 is not like it is today when that process. So just flat out, should we repeal the Congressional Budget Empowerment Control Act except for CBO?
I guess we'll go to Sarah. We'll start with you, Sarah.
I would keep it. I wouldn't repeal it. We're back to repeal and replace. Unless you can be replaced, the broader question is, and let me back up a second, right? Are we better off over these long 50 years with it than without it? Well, we have at least so far restrained presidents from taking appropriations and impounding them. And we have a source of expertise for Congress when it wants to use it to contest against the executive. So as folks who study Congress, as weak as it seems today, we're better off those 50 years than without it. So to the extent that it gives the at least the possibility that Congress could get invested in trying to use its power of the purse, that's good. And unless we have something to replace it with, I'd keep it on the books.
I would agree. I think there are places where revision is appropriate. I think, and I mentioned kind of in my initial comments, that there are, I think, changes we could make to better align the process with our current politics. I, for instance, over time have become more comfortable with the idea of sort of a series of 2-year budget agreements rather than an annual budget resolution. But I think fundamentally, the posture of the law as an assertion of congressional power against the executive branch, both in terms of, as Sarah has said, limiting the president's power to impound funds and also building up Congress's analytic capability, I think makes it a fundamentally worth keeping around.
Okay, John, do you want to get on this last word? Okay, great. All right, last question. Who was in the back there? You, sir.
Hi, my name is Peyton Lofton. I'm curious about proposals to create a bipartisan fiscal commission. The idea being that if Congress won't address our debt and deficit on their own, then we're going to take the power out of their hands and do their job for them. Do you think a commission would be effective, and how would it have to be designed in order to be the most effective?
Such a good question. I will note Speaker Johnson in his first speech as Speaker, this was his idea. This was the thing he said, I'm going to do this. And honestly, all my reporting is they just cannot get an agreement to figure it out. Who can talk about this? Yeah,
sure. So let me start and then John can come in. So what we know about these sorts of commissions, not just in the fiscal space, but in situations where Congress sets up a body, whether it's composed of members themselves or folks outside, a mix thereof, range of appointment processes, they work to address policy problems when there is consensus that there is a problem that needs solving and that what members of Congress are trying to do is avoid blame and avoid having their fingerprints on the specifics of how that problem gets solved. I don't feel like we're there on this conversation yet. I don't think there's sufficient agreement on what the problem is that members would want to be pushing off to someone else to develop the proposal to solve. And until that is true, I am not especially optimistic that something like that would be effective.
John?
I mean, the last time we tried this was Simpson-Bowles, which had a formal name, obviously, which is just Budget Deficit Reduction something, commission. But called Simpson-Bowles because it was Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles. it foundered in part because, so I think that illustrates the point that Molly's making. There was already, I think, because Obama was on board with some degree of, we'll call it austerity, right? And it failed only in as much as it had a supermajority requirement that was probably a dumb rule. And so its recommendations didn't pass, and then they created a fallback, which was called the sequester, which was like, well, then we're going to make these budget cuts that people don't really want exactly, or they don't want it to be that sort of automatic, but that's the fallback. But I think it was actually successful in as much as it represented, like, maybe this would be the outcome if Speaker Johnson was successful. Like, it represented, like, I mean, maybe this now sounds very, very Pollyannish, but like a reasonably good faith effort to address a problem, bring in people from both parties. There was an era around that, around the Budget Control Act in 2011. Like that was the last time that we really saw Republicans and Democrats doing things that weren't just kicking the can down the road or just like log rolling so everyone gets a slightly larger cut of the pie. Which part of the pie they prefer. So I don't know, like I'm not optimistic per se, but I do feel like if they can find the right people and there's really some genuine consensus to go in and the rules of the commission are not sort of an obstacle to it actually formulating recommendations. Well, let me ask the question this way. Where else is it going to come from? I don't know. I'm not sure it's going to come out of the regular congressional budget process. So if the goal is deficit reduction or something that looks like fiscal responsibility, you might as well roll the dice with the commission, even if it ends up being just window dressing, because it would be the alternative, it seems to me, is not obvious, at least in the short run.
Okay. I have to thank this fantastic panel, and thank you all for your excellent, excellent questions.
Yes, and Lisa, thank you. So a couple things. One is, Phil Joyce does have some concrete suggestions about how to change the Budget Act, maybe to have the budget committees be leadership committees, for instance, or have the president sign the budget resolution. I was kind of struck by the way we organized this morning. So Phil gave us a good look at history and unintended consequences. Nobody knew what CBO would be, and certainly nobody in '74 understood what reconciliation would be. And then on the panel I moderated, we talked rather optimistically about how we could do things better, only to be met by these guys telling us that we should be depressed. So I don't want to end on that note, and I want to mention two things that give me some hope. One is when Molly and I started talking about organizing this event, trying to figure out how to celebrate the Congressional Budget Act but be forward-looking, I went to talk to Doug Holtz-Eakin, another one of the former CBO directors in town. And Doug pointed out to me that many of the members of the staffs of the Budget Committee, indeed many of the members of the Budget Committees themselves, hadn't been around when the Budget Committees actually did anything. And so he suggested that we ask the staff directors, Republican, Democrat, House, and Senate, if they thought their staffs would be interested in a little bit of history lesson and some reflections. And we were very pleased that they said yes. Doug Elmendorf, Phil Joyce, and Austin Smythe agreed to speak. I walked into the room at 10 minutes to 10, and the only person in the room was Doug Elmendorf, and I thought this might have been one of those ideas that was better when we sounded it. By the time it was over, there were 50 staffers of the budget committees in the room who stayed for the whole hour, and some of them hung around afterwards. So somewhere up on the Hill, there are people who are thinking about how to make this process work better. I think they recognize that it's in disrepute and disrepair. And the second thing is, John mentioned these little budget games. Well, Louise and I are pretty proud of the little budget game, and Alex as well, that we've built called the Fiscal Ship. And the most interesting thing about it, it's a computer game. It's first you pick your goals for government, and then we give you some choices, tax and spending. And to win the game, you have to both achieve your goals for government and stabilize the debt. To our glee, it's been played over 1.5 million times. And the most rewarding thing is when we play it in this room with 150 college kids who are in town for a Washington semester and watch them try and resolve the issues that John put forward. And it does give you a little hope that maybe my generation and Hoagland's generation, maybe we have screwed it up, but that the kind of kids who come here for the Washington semester, who are, obviously a self-selected bunch, many of them actually are pretty serious about how do we make these choices and make the society better for themselves and their kids. So I didn't want to end on this depressing note about how screwed up the congressional. I want to say that the hope is in the young people, and we should all hope that they succeed, because we didn't. So thank you all very much.